So in Partial 3, as you know, we are looking at the United States. And I think it's important to focus on this country, although I know we tend to focus on this country a little bit too much when we think about English-speaking cultures. But because it's a country with a really complex history, it's very diverse in terms of its influences, and it's also had a massive impact on global culture too. So it's the USA, the US, the States, or a lot of people refer to the country as America. And we're going to be thinking about the following topics. So, first of all, the early colonies. Of course, we need to also think about the Native American cultures and their significance in the United States. Then we'll look at English in the United States, the influence of other cultures and languages, and then African American history, and also the conflict between Mexico and the US. So here are our learning objectives. So the first thing we're going to do is to explain the early colonial history, identify reasons for emigration to North America. Then we're going to think about American English or Englishes and its influences. And we also want to recognize the indigenous cultures in the region before colonialism and their significance in the States today. So week 1, our first lesson is the first colonies, then the 13 colonies, and then finally we'll look at Native Americans in lesson 3. And here are some questions that I want you to be able to answer by the end of this week. So I'm going to post these on Blackboard too. The questions are: who was there in the region before the Europeans? Who were the first European settlers? Why does US history focus on the English colonies when there were other colonies there too? And why is the nation called the United States of America? Why did the USA become independent? And how did colonialism affect native peoples? So some key concepts, and this will come up in your quiz, so I want you to make sure you know all of these really important terms. First of all, motive. Then religious persecution, which we'll think about in lesson 2. Mercantilism, we'll think about today. Colonies, which you've already seen. And this last one is an interesting one. It's manifest destiny. So what do we already know? What have we seen so far in this course? Well, we've seen the beginnings of the Discovery Age. So 1492 was the official discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus. We also know that England had a big rivalry with Spain, and there was a massive competition to explore the New World and claim territories. But then we also know that the British were among the last to settle in the Americas, and that the first British settlement was in Jamestown in 1607. So today we're going to think about 4 groups that were present in the United States in the very, very early days. We're going to think about the British, the Spanish, the French, and the Dutch. If we look at the map behind, we can actually see the territories that were at some point claimed by these different countries. So the green area is parts of New Spain, so territory claimed by Spain. This kind of peachy colour was land that was claimed by France, so that's all the way through the middle, massive territory going up towards Quebec, of course, and Montreal in Canada. And then this just little strip on the side, this was the British colonies. And here we had some small settlements that were from the Dutch, but they've had quite a big influence on the United States as we know it today. So, mercantilism. This is a key concept for this week. So it's also called commercialism. And this is a system in which a country attempts to amass wealth through trade with other countries, exporting more than it imports and increasing stores of gold and precious metals. And it's often considered an outdated system now. But this was the main driving force for emigration to the United States or to North America. So many countries wanted to send people over to colonize, to claim territory in order to make use of the natural resources. In this case, agriculture was really important. So agriculture, especially the cash crops like cotton and tobacco. Even sheep were quite important in the early days of colonialism in the States, and fur or animal skins. As you've seen probably in the famous Leonardo DiCaprio film, this was one of the most important trades, especially for the French in the northern part and Canada. So, because agriculture was so important, many slaves were taken to these first colonies, and the economy depended really heavily on slave labour. But another key motive was actually religious persecution. So we're going to think about that one in lesson 2. The 13 colonies. These are the English colonies. And these are 13 colonies that became 13 states. So it's on the east coast. And the first colony was started, the first permanent settlement, as we know, was Jamestown in 1607. These tend to be the focus of United States history books. So we will be looking at these tomorrow, but I want to focus on other colonies today. So in these colonies, we had settlers from England, but also from Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. There were some merchants, but many of these were actually religious groups that were fleeing, that were escaping religious persecution. So we'll think more about that in lesson 2. The French colonies were some of the first groups in North America. So they arrived in 1534. They were there before then, but the first settlement was created in 1534. So as we can see in the map, we can see this massive area. So around Louisiana and up through to Canada. So right from like the Gulf of Mexico up to Canada. So the French actually had quite a massive influence on US culture in those regions. We can still see, of course, in Canada, they still speak the French language, but also down in Louisiana, in New Orleans, there's a type of Creole French. There's a link here to a video that I'll put on Blackboard that you can listen to. So this is kind of part of the linguistic diversity of the United States. It's not just English spoken there. We still have a lot of French speakers. We can also see examples of quite French-looking architecture, especially in New Orleans. There's definitely a very French style, like we can see in this image behind. And also in cuisine, so there are some French dishes that have become popular, and they've taken on their own style, of course, in the United States. But like this very famous French dish of frog's legs. And we can also see French place names. So Detroit actually comes from the word Detroit. Louisiana, of course, is a French word. Baton Rouge. So all of these are French words that have been now kind of changed to be said in an English or an American accent. Des Moines, Bellevue, Louisville, and Delaware, which comes from the French de la guerre, or of the war. So the Spanish were among the first to explore, but the second to set up a permanent settlement. So they put their first settlement in Florida, as we can see in this fort in the image here, in the year 1565. So they actually had a huge territory, as we know, not just in the United States, but all the way through Mexico, the Caribbean, and South America too. So in North America, in the United States, as we know it today, they had land in Florida, New Mexico, California, and Texas. And we can still see a lot of Spanish influence in the culture of the United States today, especially in like Texas, with things like rodeo and cowboys coming from Spanish culture. Also in town planning, so lots of towns are built in a Spanish style with central plazas. We can also see some examples of religious architecture in the southern parts of the United States. And of course, there are many, many, many place names that come from the Spanish language. The most famous one, Los Angeles. But many states like Arizona, California, Colorado, Florida, Montana, Nevada, these all come from Spanish, obviously, and thousands of towns. So the most famous ones being like El Paso, El Monte, Dos Palos, Buena Vista, of course, again with an American accent, La Jolla, and Las Vegas. So the final group we're going to think about today are the Dutch. So the Dutch were great explorers, really, and they had territories all over the world. Uh, the Dutch had some small settlements on the east coast of the United States, most famously New Amsterdam, which later became New York. What did they leave behind? Well, again, we can see examples of Dutch style architecture, especially in New York, also in some rural areas here. This is kind of like a rural house that is in the style of a Dutch kind of farmhouse. The word Yankee is actually a word that was like a nickname for a Dutch person from like the 1700s. And in terms of cuisine, it's not necessarily a Dutch dish, but waffles were popularized in the United States by Dutch settlers in New York. So, some really famous place names in New York, which was, as we know, formerly New Amsterdam, come from Dutch words. They have been changed over the years. So, the name Brooklyn comes from a Dutch word. Also, the Bronx is from a Dutch name, and even Harlem. So these very, very famous like neighborhoods in New York all have Dutch names, which is quite interesting. So we can see that these European countries had colonies all over the continent. There were many territories that hadn't been claimed by Europe and weren't claimed for many, many years to follow. Um, but what happened to these colonies? Why do we only hear about the English colonies? Why did the English colonies become so powerful? Well, the main deciding event in history was the Seven Years' War. This is something that changed like the geographical makeup of the United States, and this is also known as the first truly global war. So it's a 7 years war, but it possibly lasted longer. It's a very, very, very complex situation, and it was mostly between Britain, Britain and France. So it was a war that kind of started in Europe, and it was between two kind of very competing global powers. But it started to, one of the main reasons was they wanted to ensure that they would be able to trade freely in North America. But there were many other conflicts all over the world. So we can see here in the map that there were two sides. So it was Britain who had sided with Portugal and other countries like areas in Germany and Prussia. Uh, and then on the other side, we had the French who had sided with the Spanish and the Russian and Sweden. So as these were times of empire, this also meant that all over the world there were many other countries involved. So here in South America, there was a conflict between the Portuguese and the Spanish. Here in areas in Africa, also in India, there were many conflicts as the British and French fought for territory and kind of battled with the Mughal Empire too, and here in the Philippines. But of course, here we're focusing on North America. In this time, the Spanish sided with the French, so that was another important, uh, well, that's another important fact about this war in the United States. So the British actually call this war the French and Indian War. And actually, in the United States, the Native Americans mostly supported the French, and the British were fighting against them for territory, for land, and agriculture. So, what happened after the war? Well, the British won, and there was a massive change of power balance in Europe. Obviously, lots of territories are given up and territories changed hands in North America. So, Florida was ceded to Britain, Louisiana was ceded to Spain, and New France was ceded to Britain too. So, the French lost enormous amounts of territory. They still had some territory in Canada, but they'd lost a lot of territory to both the Spanish and the British. But also, the Native Americans were really badly affected, and they lost a lot of territory as a result of this war. So, moving west, the British were still on the east coast, but over the next couple of 100 years, they would gain territory. First of all, Louisiana, then moving on here to I think Texas and Florida, then to Oregon, and then finally gaining land from Mexico in 1848 to 1850. So this is due to a belief held by the English colonies of manifest destiny, which is an interesting concept. And I want you guys to research this concept as your homework. What does it mean? What is manifest destiny? And what do you think this says about American culture today, or United States culture today? So that was lesson one. The next lesson will be all about the 13 colonies. So thank you for watching.